All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this next installment of our webinar series on education law. For those of you who are not familiar with Franczek PC, we're a law firm of approximately 30 attorneys, and we focus exclusively on labor and employment and education law issues. My name is Bill Pokorny. I'm a partner here at Franczek, and I'm joined by my colleague, Brianne Dunn. And before we jump into the topic of today's presentation, just a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, on the left side of your screen, you have the ability to type and submit questions. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the program by using this feature. Everyone logged into today's program will receive an email that includes a link to a recording of the webinar as well as our presentation. So the topic of today's webinar is cannabis, and specifically the new laws here in Illinois, including the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, that are going to really change the landscape for students and employees and educators here in Illinois in dealing with issues surrounding cannabis and the legalization of cannabis. And today we're thrilled to have brought in a school leader who's faced these very issues when she was a principal for the Boulder County School District out in Colorado.
That's right. We're thrilled to welcome Dr. Jerry Anderson. Dr. Anderson is an experienced educator who has taught a wide variety of subjects from grades 4 to the postgraduate level in both general and special education. She's also served as a middle school principal, high school principal, and director of secondary schools. She is the current principal of Homewood Flossmoor High School. We were lucky enough to have Jerry in our audience when speaking on this issue at our school law conference earlier this fall. Jerry was a tremendous source of knowledge on both the issues schools should anticipate as well as thoughts on staying in front of the issue as it is ever changing with technology and the various forms in which recreational marijuana can be ingested. We are delighted to have you here, Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
We'll start off with a brief introduction of the new law, and then we'll discuss questions that seem to be top of mind for school leaders across the state. We'll leave open some room for you to address any additional questions that come in throughout the webinar, as well as any topics that you'd like to address. Now let's get started.
So just to provide everybody with a quick overview again of the topics that we're going to be talking about. Again, we'll do an overview of the new law here in Illinois, and most of our discussion, we'll try to do the legal overview pretty quickly here since we have limited time together. We'd like the bulk of the webinar today really to be more of an interactive discussion with Jerry and also including all of you, because we know there are a lot of very practical, important questions that people need to have answers to, particularly before January 1st. And we'll try to conclude the session with a few action items for school districts to address. All right, so changes are obviously coming here in Illinois, and we're certainly not the first state to go through some of these changes, but let's take a quick look first of all at what we can expect here in Illinois and the changes to the legal landscape. First of all, it's important to understand what laws we're actually talking about when we talk about the changes in the legal landscape. In Illinois, there's really three different laws that we're concerned with. The biggest and sort of the largest change, and what we'll spend most of our time talking about, is the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. But in addition to that, we also have the Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis Program Act, as well as Ashley's Law. So before we turn to the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act, just to touch on those second two laws, the Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis Program Act is the law that created the Illinois pilot program for medical marijuana. This law was amended back in August to change the pilot program into a permanent program providing for the use of medical cannabis here in Illinois. And then Ashley's Law is the law that requires now school districts to have personnel available to administer cannabis under certain conditions to students who are in need of medical cannabis as part of that certified program. And again, we won't be going into the details of these laws in a great deal of detail. Certainly, if you have specific questions about what the requirements are, please do ask them, but we're just trying to give a high-level overview right now. Focusing on the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. So this is, again, passed back in June, but taking effect in terms of the legalization of recreational cannabis on January 1st of 2020. The law specifically permits Illinois residents over the age of 21 to possess and consume marijuana. Now, obviously, that has limited impact on students in K through 12 schools because most of them are not over the age of 21. But the ready availability of cannabis products, legal cannabis products, in forms that we've not really seen before, and that's one of the topics that I know Jerry will be talking about a little bit later, is definitely going to have a significant impact on how schools deal with issues of cannabis and may require schools to change their policies, procedures, and certainly have a lot of additional communication with students on these subjects. All right. Now, the one exception where students in schools are permitted to have access to cannabis products on school grounds, again, is Ashley's Law, the part of the Compassionate Use of Medical Cannabis Program Act. Ashley's Law, again, requires school districts to provide school personnel now who are able to administer cannabis products. And that's one of the topics that I'm sure we'll talk about. I know has been a large topic of discussion for example, for school nurses, many of whom are concerned about the conflict between the new state law, which requires schools to make provisions for students to access medical cannabis at school and to have school personnel there available to do it, and their own professional licensing requirements and their ability to maintain their licenses given that cannabis remains illegal under federal law. And so schools, and I'll just front the answer right now, we don't have a clear answer to how to resolve this conflict. This is going to be an evolving issue and one that schools are going to have to confront on a case-by-case basis with their employees and work to find creative solutions to resolve these conflicts between state and federal law. Now, the area that I focus most on, my background is primarily as an employment lawyer, is the workplace implications of medical cannabis. And as we all know, schools are not just schools, not just places of education, but also workplaces for school personnel. One of the main changes that the compassionate use, or the law providing for recreational cannabis provides, is to amend the Illinois Right to Privacy in the Workplace Act. To provide that cannabis is now considered a legal product in the state of Illinois, even though it remains illegal under federal law. It's a legal product in the state of Illinois, and like alcohol, like tobacco, employers are legally prohibited from taking action against an employee who uses a lawful product. And the cannabis is now, again, included in that definition. Now, employers can still maintain policies prohibiting employees from possessing, using, consuming, or being under the influence of cannabis at work, and that certainly includes school grounds. But before disciplining an employee for that, for violating those policies, an employer has to have a good faith basis to believe that the employee is violating one of those workplace-related policies. So what does that mean? Effectively, again, employees can still prohibit possession, use, being under the influence, but it has to be related to the workplace. So employers cannot punish employees for medical or recreational use of cannabis as long as it's not on or affecting the workplace. The biggest impact of this on employer policies and procedures really has to do with drug testing for employees. Under the new law, drug testing is still definitely permitted, but it can't be the sole basis for discipline where there's no other reason to believe that an employee is impaired. This morning I had the opportunity to speak to a group of employers, and we spent the better part of 45 minutes talking about all the implications this has for when you can test, when you can't test. Should you include THC in your pre-employment drug screening panels if you do pre-employment drug screening? The answer by and large is no. When can you do reasonable suspicion testing? And should you include drug testing as part of your reasonable suspicion protocol for dealing with drugs? These are all evolving answers, but generally speaking, employers used to be able to discipline employees based solely on a positive drug test. In Illinois, that is no longer the case once January 1st rolls around. So that's going to be a sea change for employers. When can an employer consider an employee to be impaired? And again, these slides will be available after the program for reference, but this is the language from the statute. The employer has to have a good faith belief that an employee manifests specific articulable symptoms while working that decrease or lessen the employee's performance of the duties or tasks of the employee's job position. And the law goes on to give some examples. Notice that one of the examples not included in the statute is a positive drug test. So while drug testing can continue to be an important part of an employer's response to improper use of cannabis, it's no longer the end-all, be-all. All right, so that's the legal background. I know we rushed through that pretty quickly, but we really want to focus on a discussion, a practical discussion of what do these legal changes mean for schools. And so for that, I'm going to throw it over to Brianne and Dr. Anderson.
Great. And just to mention, we are so grateful to have you here, Jerry, and especially with your experience back in Colorado. It is so nice to know that you've been through this once before and we can truly learn from what you've seen. So jumping into that, can you describe some of the initial issues you saw as the legislation first took effect back in Colorado?
I don't think we were really prepared for the impact, especially the impact on schools, because as you said, it's an adult law. But I can tell you within the first 6 months, some of the things we begin to see is an increased potency in the marijuana that we did discover, discovering a number of different forms of marijuana, different types of edibles, and different ways to use marijuana that, students hadn't previously been using, and therefore another way to think about the impact of it. So we're talking about quality, type, ways to use it, and then therefore the impact that it's going to have.
And how did you address that as you saw these things coming in, this increased potency, these new mechanisms where you're finding marijuana? How did you address that as a school?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that, to be honest. If you just take a second, if you're sitting at a computer and you Google marijuana baked goods or marijuana candy, you'd be surprised at the things that you're going to see, because at one time, everybody has this idea of what marijuana looks like, right? Now all of a sudden, you're going to be able to see marijuana that looks like a gummy bear, that looks like gummy worms, that looks like candy that you buy every day. Chocolate chip cookies, not just the old brownies that people were expecting back in the day. Cereal. There's so many different things that you're going to be able to see that at one time, what you looked for and what you're going to have to look for now is going to be different. Yeah. So I'd say the bottom line to all of that is saying you're really going to need to know your students. Parents are going to need to know their kids. Teachers are going to need to know their students so that you notice that change in behavior so that you can tell if they might have ingested something and they're acting different than their normal self.
Yeah. We were discussing offline earlier, you have some proactive strategies that you're using with your school now to prepare for these changes with respect to proactive education. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and what you're going to be doing?
First thing really was bringing my team up to date on some of the things that they might be seeing that they haven't seen in the past, and seeing how easy it is to get access and purchase some of these things, different ways to use the marijuana. In addition, we want to do something for both our staff and our parents and students. And that really is to educate them about what's coming up and what they can expect to see. We want to have a panel, for example, where we bring in psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, people who help with addiction and recovery, just so that students and parents and staff really know how serious using marijuana can be.
We talked a little bit about this as well. I wonder, because when you were back in Colorado, if you could speak to some of those longer-term serious issues you saw with students, perhaps students that started using edibles in different forms on a daily basis.
Well, the old adage is that, marijuana is not addictive. You can just use it and put it down whenever you want to. But one of the things that, you might be facing is now marijuana can be considered to be a gateway drug. In other words, students who are people, not just students, people who get used to a particular high, now you're going to have to maybe want a higher high sometimes. So that might lead to not only to ingesting different marijuana in different forms or more marijuana, but really looking at for different drugs that give you that higher high so you can get where you used to be when you first started using.
And I know you mentioned bringing in a team of medical professionals, psychologists, and such. Do you plan on doing this regularly? How will you stay in front of sort of the way that this evolves and the technology and potency for marijuana products?
We're just going to have to really just keep educating ourselves. And really, I've reached back and talked to my friends from Colorado and from other places, and I've said, hey, you know, tell me some of the things that have happened since I left. What are some of the things that you're seeing now that we weren't seeing in the very beginning? And I would say one of my colleagues said, Jerry, sometimes it's going to be right in front of you and you're not going to know it.
Yeah.
And that's really hard for people to believe, because when people think about marijuana, they think about walking around under a cloud of smoke. And that is just not what modern, sophisticated marijuana use looks like.
Just in recapping before we turn to some questions that have come in, it sounds like educating your staff, but also educating your students and parents, and doing this on a regular basis is your strategy here. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Let's get them started in the beginning so that they know that there's some unintended things that could perhaps happen. I mean, even things like kids picking up marijuana that's an edible form that maybe an older brother or sister or parent might have, thinking it's candy.
Right. The new frontier here. So some questions that have come in that I'd like to read, and Dr. Anderson, if you can help us address these, that would be great. The first one is there a gold standard of rules regarding how to search students you suspect are under the influence? Bags and jackets are easy, but a step-by-step guide to searching the student.
Well, I think you have to know what you have to do, what you can legally do. You know, I think the easiest thing, as always, you bring that student in your office. To me, it's always asking that person, do you have anything in your possession that you shouldn't have? And give them an opportunity to self-disclose.
And, you know, I mean, I think it's a hard question to answer in terms of a gold standard of rules. You know, we're often asked for, hey, can you give us a checklist of things you can go through that would tell me if I can do a search under these circumstances or what I need to do for a search? And the answer, unfortunately, most of the time is no. I mean, we can tell you what the general rules are, but by and large, these circumstances are so individualized. You really need, when you're considering conducting a search, and particularly if it's an individualized search of the student, we need to go through, and you should be talking to your counsel about, okay, what's the basis for reasonable suspicion to make sure it really exists there. And certainly if you're considering doing a broader-based search of the student body, you know, again, talk to counsel about, okay, what's the purpose for this? What's the justification? What's the reason to believe that we need to conduct this search in the educational environment, and make sure that those circumstances are all there. And so unfortunately, there really is no gold standard or checklist or set of rules that we can give you that would apply to all circumstances.
It's going to look different student to student and circumstance to circumstance, so that's a really good point.
Not to add fuel to the fire, but because these products now are evolving, and as we discussed earlier, there's a product where it looks like a highlighter. It says highlighter, but you can stash marijuana inside of that. It's becoming more difficult, and hitting that standard for reasonable suspicion is going to be a challenge. Moving on to the next question. With the new law and increased access to different types of edibles, when will it be considered reasonable to search a student who may be under the influence?
Yeah, I think it's the same kind of question. And this goes not just to students, by the way. It's also employees. When do you have reasonable suspicion to think that an employee might be under the influence? Because that's going to be an issue for schools, just as other employers. It's really a matter of making sure that you have personnel, administrators, who are trained to recognize what are the signs of impairment. You know, what indicators do we look at? Changes in behavior, physical indicators, indicators, and what can support reasonable suspicion. We're not medical doctors, so I don't know that I can go Google the list of things that's a sign of when somebody's under the influence just as well as anybody else. You really need to get professionals to help educate you.
I would just add to that, just don't expect that it's going to be what it's always been.
Right.
It used to be people look, oh, let me smell the tips of your fingers, or do you smell like marijuana? And people have to understand that you're not going to necessarily be able to smell it.
Right.
And I know people find that hard to believe, but you're not always going to know that it's right there.
We had a couple questions come in about drug testing to answer those. So one was, if an employee is suspected of using marijuana and consents to a drug test, how many nanograms of THC must be present in the employee's blood before they are considered intoxicated or be subject to grounds for dismissal? There is a standard in Illinois for when somebody will be presumed to be intoxicated for driving while for DWI purposes. Whether that is going to be applicable to the school environment for whether a student or an employee is impaired, that's not at all clear under the law, nor is it clear whether you'll be able to get access to that information from your testing provider. So my answer to that question would be, you need to talk to the professionals. You need to talk to your testing vendor, talk to their medical review officers, and find out what information they can provide you. But I can tell you that the statute doesn't make reference to any particular level of testing that's going to be dead bang evidence. You need to have additional evidence, observational evidence of impairment beyond just the test results. And then somebody else asked the question of, is there a breath or saliva test out there for marijuana? Yes, there's a saliva test, but I was just talking with a testing vendor this morning. Those tests are not considered terribly reliable by the testing vendors. So again, talk to your professionals.
One thing to add as well, especially on the school side, as you are trying to determine whether you think a student may be under the influence, when you're training your staff, you want to be very consistent in making sure that everybody has the same knowledge of signs, because what you can often run into is that subjectivity in determining whether a student is under the influence, and that's just something we want to be cautious of as we move forward. Dr. Anderson, did you see any of this when you were in Colorado, and how did you handle making sure that while you kept the school community safe from these issues, you also were fair with discipline across the board?
Well, there's a lot of different things that you're going to be looking at with discipline. For example, what happens when someone brings treats for their birthday and it happens to be laced with marijuana? It's a baked good. It looks like cookies. It looks like brownies. Or someone just sneaks something into something, and a person inadvertently ends up taking something that they really did not know was going to have THC in it. You're going to have to know how you're going to respond to that. And then also just from the medical side, because students aren't going to know necessarily all the time. Young people don't know how much they're ingesting. When you think about edibles, a bag of gummy bears is a bag of gummy bears. Do you eat the whole bag of gummy bears just like you did when you bought it from the store that was gummy bears? Do you eat the whole Rice Krispie treat? Do you eat the whole brownie? I mean, what's that like? And then what's the impact that it has on the individual ingesting it, depending on their weight and their size and all of that?
So overall, if you could describe for us what you thought was the biggest challenge you ran into when in Colorado, and how you're going to get in front of that particular challenge here in Illinois?
I really think it's just, I think no one really knew what to anticipate. I think it's important for us to talk to other people who've already been through this, ask them what they're experiencing on the onset, what they're experiencing now that it's been legal for a while. Just continue to beef up your education so that, you're not caught so unaware. It's just like knowing that you can take the jewels that people buy and that the kids know how to actually replace that oil with marijuana oil instead of THC. I mean, how do you have to know what's going on? And to do that, you have to be able to talk to people and talk to kids and learn from what you get and the experiences that you have.
So one of the questions was, do we have any resources to help organizations develop guidelines for managers? Certainly, to the extent that you have an occupational health clinic, for example, University of Chicago, Ingalls, was just talking with a representative there today, no endorsement, but, they're a good resource. Your testing vendors can help with this. Jerry, I don't know if you have any particular resources on the educational side, other organizations that you're consulting with or resources that you're thinking of using or could recommend to other educators?
Honestly, right now, I'm really relying on colleagues that I've had that have been through this before. We work with an organization that says no endorsement. Rosecrans is where we deal with our drug testing. There are a lot of different places. You think about the states where it's been legalized, like California, like Colorado. I would definitely go. I'd look at the resources found in those particular states, and I would ask questions.
All right. One last question before we end the webinar. Somebody asked, did you, in your experience in Colorado, see an increase in accidental overdoses was the question, or accidental ingestions?
Absolutely. I think something that, as far as I know with the Illinois state law right now, there's nothing in place that has anything about having edibles look like regular everyday goods that kids can ingest. And one of the things that happened is in Colorado, they had to actually change the law. So they said, no, we can no longer make marijuana edibles look so much like what kids ingest. Accidental overdose, absolutely. Accidental ingestion, yes.
And with that, it sounds like you're going to need help on both the discipline side, but of course the medical side as well. We know that can end and look not well for a student who's had too much, and so it's important that you have both teams ready to go. And moving forward, and given some next steps to school districts, one thing that we've heard both from Jerry and we've been counseling on is just having that proactive communication. This is really important to address with parents and guardians at the beginning of this upcoming year. Emphasize the district's expectations for students and student athletes. Discuss the protocol for handling suspected student use and or possession. That should be something that's known by your school community up front, not something that they're learning after the fact. And just discuss any additional ways in which the district plans to deter student use or possession, especially those educational opportunities, as Dr. Anderson shared as well. Finally, our next steps in handling this new legislation, we are recommending that you revise drug policies to specifically prohibit employees from possessing, using, or being impaired by cannabis on the employer's premises or during work hours. We are asking that you train managers on how to identify signs of impairment and how to document their observations. And finally, we're asking you to implement a process for employees who have been disciplined for suspected cannabis use to challenge the decision.
All right, and just to wrap up the webinar today, let's see, any last questions? Sorry, getting back to our question queue here.
And as you get towards your questions, I just want to add, make sure that you're not just going on what you've known in the past to be marijuana use or identifying someone under the influence. Make sure you try to educate yourself more about what you're going to be seeing so that you are more prepared. And knowing what a student ingests and how much they ingest is going to be really important too, so that you can respond medically as immediately as you need to.
Great. All right, and so it does look like we're about out of time. I know there are a number of questions that we didn't get to answer in the course of the webinar today. Certainly feel free to reach out to myself, Bree, Jerry after the presentation, and we'll be happy to chat with all of you. Also, please do save the date for our next webinar coming up on December 10th. We'll be talking about Title IX and both on on the student and on the employment side. We hope you found today's program helpful. You'll receive an email today with the link to the program recording and the presentation, as well as a link to register for upcoming webinars. We hope you all have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.